Excellent. As you doubtless figured, I'm doing this presenting on my own, so I will do my best to keep an eye on things, but don't be surprised if I don't pick up on your comments in the chat as quickly as I would really like to. Okay, so we have two things to look at today. First of all, an ISO20022 version of Mojaloop, and second, currency conversion and foreign exchange. So without further ado, let's start on an ISO20022 version of Mojaloop. I want to start by just reminding ourselves why we're doing this. So people are already using ISO20022 messages. Global organizations want to concentrate on them. And existing banks, though not other kinds of participant, are used to using ISO20022 messages to support payments. As far as the community is concerned, we get aligned with an established international standard for payment systems. We get the chance to influence the structures and purposes of ISO20022 messages to align it better, or perhaps I should say even better, with the level 1 principles. And the ability to extend the reach of those messages to new types of participants and jurisdictions, as well as removing some of the roadblocks to Mojaloop entry for scheme operators and participants. So what do we propose for PI 16? First of all, a switch-hosted ISO version of Mojaloop for one implementation. That has gone rather more slowly than we had anticipated. We are still working on that, and we will do it, but we haven't got as far as a switch-hosted ISO version. What we have got, and which has been tested and validated by the implementer, is a payment manager-hosted ISO version of Mojaloop. So we are seeing test messages being passed through a system using the ISO20022 messaging format. We then proposed a version of our extensions to existing messages agreed by the ISO20022 organization. Those we've talked about a couple of times in the past. They're not very substantial, but we really need them. Third, potential ISO20022 solutions to the following issues, particularly identifier management, currency conversion, which ISO doesn't currently support, at least not in a retail way, authorization, which, as far as we're aware, ISO20022 doesn't support at all, and the definition of account relationships for third-party payment initiators. And we also proposed a draft Mojaloop ISO20022 market practice document. I just want to say a little bit more about a market practice document for those who are not aware of it. So the messages that ISO20022 defines are quite well established, and people, I think, generally speaking, know what they are. But the market practice document is in many ways a much more important thing, because that's a document that we, the Mojaloop Foundation, can publish without any reference or approval from the ISO20022 organization itself. And really what it describes is how to do the things that we want to do using ISO20022 messages. It says which messages to use in those messages, which fields to use or not to use, and also says what it means for the scheme as a whole to use those messages. And the other point about it is it needs to be complete. It needs to provide an end-to-end guide of how to use ISO20022 messages in a Mojaloop context. Now, I emphasize that at this point because it's going to be an important part of the discussion a bit later on. So, principle, it sounds as if we're doing kind of okay. We know how to use the ISO20022 messages to talk Mojaloop in particular cases, but that's not really the same thing as an ISO20022 version of Mojaloop. And I want to emphasize the of Mojaloop part, because we've made a slight change in our original plans for how we interface with ISO20022. The original plan was we would repurpose a selection of standard message formats for Mojaloop's particular purposes. We'd modify message content where necessary, add new messages where none existed, and then specialize those existing messages using a market practice document. Now, those of you who've seen ISO20022 message definitions will know that they have, almost without exception, a great deal of information in them, most of which would not necessarily be useful to us. However, that was the place from which we started. Now, the drawbacks of this are, as we've said, there are some areas where we need coverage, but there are no ISO messages. We wanted to use some messages in a way different from the way in which the general ISO 20022 community would understand them. Also, some of the messages we proposed would need considerable specialization for long-term use in the Mojaloop context. And an example of that is directory lookup. Now, directory lookup for us means something quite different from what it means in the ISO world. I'll talk a little bit more detail about that, but it does mean that these things are quite different in the ISO world from the way they look to us. And we would still be combining specializing messages in a way that aligns with our requirements, but wouldn't necessarily be very easy to understand for parties who already knew about ISO 20022 messages in other contexts. And finally, we'll be asking participants who were not traditional banks, people like mobile money operators, MFIs, SACCOs, all kinds of other types of institution, to absorb expertise about payment messages which weren't necessarily strictly relevant to what Mojaloop wants to do and to the sorts of activities that Mojaloop intends to support. So we basically thought of an alternative approach. Now, the existing ISO 20022 data dictionary contains most of the structures that Mojaloop needs. It's not completely true, but broadly speaking, it's true. We could, we realized, use these structures to build a suite of messages appropriate, directly appropriate to what Mojaloop is and how it wants to work. And we could accompany those proposals with an ISO 20022 business justification to explain to the ISO 20022 community why it was that the things Mojaloop wants to do and needs to do are worth doing and important to do. So effectively, we'll be saying Mojaloop works well at the thing it wants to be. ISO 20022 should recognize that and approve a set of messages that allows not just Mojaloop, but any form of interop switch which does the same sorts of things as Mojaloop to work in the ISO field as well. And we would then explain them to participants, to Mojaloop participants, using a market practice document, as we said before. So what are the advantages and disadvantages here? Well, all the endpoints required to operate a Mojaloop scheme would use members of the same suite of messages, which would make things simpler to understand and less confusing to people. I mean, certainly the plans that we had before involved collecting messages that currently belong to quite different catalogs and putting them all together in the same context. Second, standard representational techniques, for instance, the way in which we represent a party, could be consistent across all the messages, which is not necessarily the case at the moment. It's mostly the case with the ISO 20022 messages. But in cases where, as I say, these messages belong in fact to different catalogs, there are or may be subtle differences between the ways in which the same thing in a Mojaloop context is represented in different ways in the existing ISO 20022 messages. We wanted also that information that really wasn't relevant to the Mojaloop payment model was excluded from the message definition, and not just by saying in the market practice document, we do not use these fields, do not include them. Fourth, we thought that external parties, and particularly parties who aren't used already to using ISO 20022 messages, would find it easier to understand how to interact with a Mojaloop system, because the general principles of the form of the messages that we use would be more available and easier for them to understand. On the other hand, institutions brackets banks, which already make payments using ISO messages, may need to learn a new way of managing payments. But to some extent, that will be true anyway, because the way in which, as I'm sure you know, we manage payments in the Mojaloop world is different from the way in which banks normally transfer funds between each other. The other point was that valuable generalization, the learnings from long periods of abstraction and generalization in the message definition field for the ISO20022 catalog might be lost, because we would start again from scratch, and it's possible that a lot of thinking, a lot of contextual thinking about how to represent things might be lost, or still worse, reinvented like the wheel. So, an ISO 20022 business justification explains the business purpose that this message set supports. It explains the characteristics of the messages we need to support that business purpose, and gives reasons why we need them. And in particular, can talk about apparently attractive existing messages and why they may or may not be appropriate. But the important point here is that it's about messages, not endpoints. Now, I'm sure those of you who have spent even a little time with the existing FSP IOP API will be aware that it's really organized in terms of endpoints, and that for each endpoint, there is a definition of the structure of the information that's passed through that endpoint. ISO 20022 views things from the message point of view, not the endpoint point of view. So it's much closer to a standard document definition way of looking at things. And this, I think, will come out, I hope, a little bit more clearly in some of the things that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So what then is the business purpose of Mojaloop? I hope this won't be contentious, but I am happy for people to improve on this definition. I have to say that I'm sure it can be improved on. So if you've got better ideas, then I'd love to hear them. So it supports straight through instant payments, i.e., as far as possible, automated instant payments which do not require direct intervention from any of the participants direct manual intervention, I mean, in order to be able to succeed. Second, those payments are between institutions, not between individual account holders. And third, they don't depend on existing relationships between those institutions. So what Mojaloop wants to do, one of the most important things in my mind that it wants to do, is it wants to provide a way for institutions to interact with each other without requiring that they know anything at all about what kind of institution they're interacting with, except for the fact that all of those institutions can be members of the Mojaloop scheme. So that's, broadly speaking, my current draft definition of what the business purpose of Mojaloop is. Next, it looks at messages, not endpoints. So ISO 20022 wants to define general forms which can then be specialized for particular purposes. Now let me see if I can try and illustrate what I think I'm talking about by an example. So let's look at identification. An identification associates an identifier. It might be a MSDN, it might be a merchant ID. You heard Paul talking about those earlier this afternoon. Or it might be an IBAN number or a bank account. But it associates an identifier with a participant and with some additional information about the entity who has been so identified. Now, Mojaloop currently defines an identification as a nested structure. At the simplest level, we've got an FSP ID, which just says, this is the DFSP who manages this account, whatever it is. On top of that, we have an identifier type and identifier value so that we can associate an FSP ID with a particular identity type and value. On top of that, we have a party, which adds to that additional information like a display name, possibly a date of birth, other KYC information. And on top of that, for example, we have a party result, which is returned from an attempt to register an identifier in the ALS, and just says what the result of that identification attempt was. Now, we then use the structure appropriate to the particular endpoint that we're talking about. So in post transfers, we just use an FSP ID because post transfers just talks about transfers of funds between DFSPs. In post participants, we use an FSP ID plus an identifier type and an identifier value. In post quotes, we use a party because we can include additional information, KYC information, for instance, about the identifier and its FSP. And in put participants, as I've just said, we add the status, i.e. the result of trying to add it or modify it in the ALS. So that's essentially, I hope people will recognize, as the way in which the Mojaloop FSP API currently structures things. The ISO20022 approach, I think, on the other hand, wants to define a single structure and specialize its use in particular endpoints using the market practice document. So if we imagine that we had the whole structure as we've defined it at the lowest level previously, we could just say that is our definition of an identification. Much of that information will be optional, and for its use in particular endpoints, we would say things like, for a party definition, so for this we would say things like, if you are using this in the context of a transfer, you must have the FSP ID, but you don't have to have anything else. If you're using it in the context of a post quotes, you must have the identifier type and the identifier value and the FSP ID, but again, you don't have to have anything else. So in fact, you should not have some things. It will say, do not fill these fields in. So you can see that the incarnation of a particular message type at an endpoint is something which in the ISO20022 world, I think, belongs to the market practice document and not to the message set itself. So what kinds of messages are we thinking about? Party identification is one. The definition of terms, definition of relationships, and that's the 3 PPI kind of thing, relationships in that sense, authorization, cryptographic locks, idempotency identification, and additional information, which we kind of want all over the place. But I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail, each of them. So what have we got in party identification? Well, there's an identifier, which is a type and a value. There is optional ancillary information, optional status information, and an FSP ID, a statement about which party this identification belongs to. For terms, well, they are things which define an action which results in the creation of financial obligations under the rules of a scheme. This sounds like a complicated way of just talking about funds transfer. But one of the things that I wanted to say is that actually transfer terms and currency conversion terms are really varieties of the same kind of thing. We've tended to treat them separately because of our, well, partly I think because of our standard Mojaloop ways of thinking. But it might also be possible, I'm going to suggest, to think of them as varieties of the same thing. So they contain a definition of the parties, a definition of the amounts associated, which may be one or more than one, depending on what kind of agreement is being made. There will be principal amounts, fees, and commission amounts. And again, there'll be ancillary information of various kinds, as for instance, there might be a definition of the transaction type. Relationships then. So they define a relationship between two institutions in relation to one or perhaps more customer identities. And when I say one or more customer identities, I mean we allow in the third-party payment initiator interface, we allow a relationship to be set up between more than one account for the same customer. So, for instance, we allow a third-party payment initiator to say, I would like access to Mike's savings account and his transaction account. And that's perfectly, it's not the sort of thing that says, oh, I want access to Mike's account, and I'd like access to Miller's account, and I'd like access to Sam's account. So it's one or more customer identities associated with the same identity. Sorry, I should say identifications there, shouldn't I? So they contain identifications, what kind of thing and what kind of identifier am I talking about? Actions, by which I mean the kinds of actions that a third-party payment initiator is allowed to perform. So for some accounts, it might be just look at the balance. For other accounts, it might be initiate transfers out of that account. Another account might have a right to get a statement of that account. So there are different actions that can be performed on those accounts. And then we have credential definitions, the types of credential that a third-party payment initiator needs to present in order to get access to that particular, in order to perform that particular action. And again, those credentials may be different depending on the kind of action that you want to perform. So those are relationships. Then there are authorizations, which are used by an institution to delegate customer authorization for an action to another institution. We already have that, as I'm sure you're aware, in the Mojaloop API to allow, for instance, DFSP to request the operator of an ATM to obtain an authorization code from a customer who is standing, a customer of the first DFSP who is standing at the ATM. We also, of course, use it in third-party payment initiation interface so that the DFSP can say to the third-party payment initiator, please get a fingerprint or a PIN from your customer so that I can verify that they really have consented to this transfer. They contain a challenge, typically, something to be signed, a definition of terms, perhaps. So a thing that said, this is a challenge relating to these terms, an authorization type, which might be a FIDO authorization, it might be a one-time PIN, anything like that, and that's that. Cryptographic locks allow institutions to verify the content of the requests. They just contain a signature, a validity period, and in some cases, the terms to which the signature relates, optionally, that is. And finally, there's idempotency information, which is used to differentiate instances of messages of the same type. And that contains basically a UUID. It's the thing we have typically the first item of any request that we make via a post endpoint. It just says this is this is the unique identifier of the particular thing that I'm talking about. So that if I resend the idempotency functions of the switch, we'll look at it and say, oh, we've seen this already. We're not going to process it again. We will just send back information about the status of it. So if we look at an example, a quotation contains a required, sorry, a quotation request, that is, a required idempotency identifier, an optional cryptographic lock, a required definition of terms. And then we'd say, well, a quotation request must not include a cryptographic lock. A quotation acceptance must include a cryptographic lock. and all of these kinds of things. But as I've already said, these conditions, those two just above, will form part of the market practice document and not of the message definition. So the message definition will be comprehensive, and that will be specialized in various ways by the market practice document. So where are we now? Sorry, I've just seen a chat thing up here. So if you excuse me one moment, I'll try and... Oh, thank you, Innocent. So where are we now? Well, draft business justification has been prepared and submitted to the ISO20022 Payment Special Interest Group. Initial feedback has been received, which I have to say was, well, I won't call it brutal, but it was certainly comprehensive, should I say. And we are currently incorporating feedback into a revised submission. So what do we plan for the next PI? A business justification to be made available for review and comment by the Mojaloop community. Now, as soon as we have got this in a position where it can be submitted, we will make it available so that interested parties can take a look and comment on that. We want to get the business justification approved by the ISO20022 payments group. Now, obviously, we're in their hands as to when that actually happens, but we would hope that it can be done by the end of the next quarter. We will produce a draft market practice document, which will be submitted for review by Mojaloop special interest groups, specifically, in particular, the third-party payment interface group, the FSP IOP group, and, well, no, the FX group is in the same place. So, yeah, so those will be the two main considering things, and by the CCB. We also want to review this with potential implementers and other interested parties, because essentially what we will need to do by the time we get to the end of this process is have a definition which is agreed both by the ISO20022 standards organization and by the relevant approving bodies in the Mojaloop community. So this will be an interesting balancing act that I'm sure that with your help and support, that will all be fabulous and we will have nothing to worry about. So that really gets me to the end of what I wanted to say about where we are currently with the ISO20022 application. Would anyone like to ask any questions at this point before I pass over to currency conversion and foreign exchange?
I'm watching the chat for you, Michael, to see if there's any questions in the chat.
Thank you very much, Simeon.
And just a reminder to everyone, please give Michael some feedback on those polls, on the poll on your screen. Any questions?
I would also like to compliment you, Simeon, on allowing us presenters to vote on our presentations this time around.
I'm pretty sure you're going to
go on, take a guess on which button I'm just about to press.
All right. Well, Michael, you have saved up some time. There was still another 11 minutes left in your presentation, but you can roll that in to the next one, the FX support.
Oh, sorry. So we have a question here that says, what were some of the instructive feedback points with the business justification? I said it was, well, the main one was this, that we just need to concentrate on messages. Their main objection to the original one was that essentially what we had done was rather, as you will have seen in previous presentations about ISO20022 versions of Mojaloop, which was to say we take the existing endpoints and to each endpoint we attach a message, which is a message specific to that endpoint. Now, they wanted to say forcefully to us, you shouldn't be doing that. All that ISO20022 cares about is the message. And you need to think about what the message is supposed to represent, and therefore what characteristics it needs to have. And it's out of that comes the thread that's been running through quite a lot of my presentation, which is to say, you can always specialize the content of the message in a particular endpoint using the market practice document. And the ISO20022 organization doesn't care how you do that. This is wholly an internal matter for us. The only thing that the ISO20022 committee and community cares about is, what does the message contain? What does the message need to contain? And given that that's the case, it makes sense, both from a definitional point of view and from a maintenance forward-thinking point of view, to reduce as far as possible the number of messages that we have to deal with. Because one of the things that we don't want to do, I mean, at the moment, for instance, as I'm sure you'll be aware, as you go through the process of quoting and transferring for a particular transfer of funds, a lot of the messages are relatively similar to each other, and that means, at least potentially, that if you make a change, then you have to make it in several different places, and you have to make sure that those different places are aligned with each other. Whereas if you have a single message that represents, let's say, a set of terms or something like that, and is specialized in various ways at a particular endpoint or at a particular set of endpoints, then you can just change the message content itself. And with a bit of luck, it will be very much easier to manage the movement of that message through the different endpoints using the market practice document. It will certainly be the case that though if we were to change the content of a message, we would need to resubmit that to the ISO standards body for approval. But if all we were going to do was change the market practice document, then, as I say, we could do that ourselves without asking anybody. Excellent. Sorry, and I see I have a message of support from Mike Schruter. I am looking forward to it too, Mike. Okay, any other questions on that? Nope. Right.
I don't see any other, so I think you can proceed to the next.
Okay.